We're back now with former Secretary of State John Kerry. He is in town as part of a UN push to combat climate change. Mr. Secretary, good to see you here.
Great to have you here. Happy to be with you. Thank you.
We want to talk to you about this climate project, but I want to start on Iran.
Sure.
The United States is not required to defend Saudi Arabia in the wake of this attack. But does the U.S. look weak if it doesn't militarily respond?
Not if we do other things that show strength and confidence in a genuine strategy and policy, and that's what's really lacking here, I think. You've got to go back to the beginning here. We had an agreement. We have an agreement that the rest of the world supports.
The nuclear deal.
The nuclear agreement. And I heard Secretary Pompeo say, well, we want to get into a place where we know they can't have a nuclear weapon. Well, we're there. We were there. And France, Germany, Britain, China, Russia all still support a multilateral agreement that was a model of multilateral diplomacy. We came together, the world welcomed this, the United Nations Security Council ratified it, embraced it, and that still is there. Along comes President Trump, and he pulls out. He broke the agreement.
You think pulling out caused this escalation?
The escalation is the absolutely foreseeable, and it was foreseen that this is what would happen. Why do I say that? Because we were ridiculed for saying that the alternative to what we were trying to do in making the agreement was war, was conflict. I mean, I personally had leaders in the Middle East telling me, you got to bomb Iran. We had a prime minister of Israel come to America and ask for a green light to bomb. So we were averting war. And when we signed the agreement in Vienna, the initial agreement, we all agreed that this was a way to avoid a war and open up a channel of communicating and diplomacy to be able to deal with legitimate other issues that are concerned with Iran. We're concerned about their support for Hezbollah. We're concerned about their missiles. We're concerned about Yemen. We're concerned about interference in other countries. But what is the best way to deal with that, Margaret? That's the question.
But can the nuclear deal be salvaged now, given that Iran is already starting to push the limits and cheat here?
Well,
there are sunset clauses.
Yes, they are. Look, I think, you've got to be really clear and honest about what's happening here. I believe Iran, one way or the other, was behind the attack that took place. That, to me, is obvious. It's also obvious that it's got to be denied. And it will be denied right now because they need the plausible deniability. But the president, I think, is actually correct to be evaluating sort of not being rushed into a corner to go to war. That is what we shouldn't do. But you've also got to look at what happened afterwards, after we pulled out. We basically declared economic war on Iran. We have been pressuring them, maximum pressure. And it was entirely foreseeable that that would result in further conflict. So we're seeing the unfolding of really a bankruptcy of approach. The international community can come together now. I think there is a way to avert war without showing weakness.
I want to take a quick break and have a more extended conversation on the other side of it. Don't go anywhere.
Great.
Secretary Kerry, all of you stay with us, and a conversation about climate change ahead. This week, the UN will host international leaders in meetings aimed at changing behaviors to combat climate change. But it is the younger generation taking their cause to streets around the world. We will be right back with that. Some of our stations are leaving us now, but we will be right back with more from John Kerry. Stay with us. Welcome back to Face the Nation. We continue our conversation with former Secretary of State John Kerry. Mr. Secretary, at the bit of our conversation where we left off, you said you do see a diplomatic off-ramp here, away from conflict.
Our allies still support the agreement, but our allies also, the nuclear agreement, but they also support holding Iran accountable for other issues in the region. I believe better diplomacy, more diplomacy with our allies, bringing people together. There is a road to an agreement that could provide a full new security arrangement for the region and deal with the nuclear issue.
Now, you famously negotiated the Paris Climate Change Accord. I remember you going to the signing with your granddaughter on your knee. Yeah. You felt really passionate about this. But even you say that was not sufficient.
Correct.
Every Democrat running says they're going to rejoin this accord.
Yes,
so
not adequate.
It's not adequate.
No.
What more needs to be done?
An enormous amount. We have to transition very rapidly to electric vehicles. We have to get to a net zero carbon economy in our country by 2050. We have to, by 2030, have moved significantly in the direction of major changes. Every scientist who has been involved in this for years is telling us we have a certain number of years in order to be able to respond, and no nation in the world is responding adequately. So we're going to create a movement here in America, I believe, that will, and across the world, actually, a global movement called World War Zero. And you can go to worldwarzero.com now, and there's an introductory page. In October, we'll be filling out the full website. But we will be announcing this in full with big names, a big concept that is going to help change the political dynamic in America. It's going to create political accountability around the world for leaders who are not doing what is necessary.
Well, about 60 countries at the UN this week are expected to make some kind of pledge to reduce...
Some kind is a good word.
Some kind of pollution. If the United States, the Trump administration, and China aren't leading this, is it meaningless?
Well, it's not meaningless.
They're the two biggest polluters.
No, it's not meaningless. There are countries, India, China, are going to make announcements, and it's steps forward. But the United States of America represents the second largest amount individually of emissions that contribute to this. China is 25%. We're 15%. We have to be at the table. We have to be involved. And this is a life and death issue as kids. I mean, 16-year-old kids and a lot of children all around the world are saying, save the future for us. They can't vote in the Congress. They don't have a position in the boardroom right now. So more and more companies are actually coming to the table. We're working with a group called We Mean Business, 1,000 companies, $21 trillion of assets. They're committed to moving. And I believe we can change the dynamic and hold politicians accountable. That's the key. We did it in 1970 with Earth Day. We created the EPA. We created the Clean Air Act, many other things. We have to create political accountability and make this an issue that will motivate people.
So on that point, is there a Kerry standard when it comes to endorsing one of the candidates running for president? Is this an issue you want to see specific policies on before you endorse any Democrats?
This has to be one of the top voting issues in our nation and in the world. And it has to be one of the top organizational issues. That's why it's called World War Zero, because the world has to be involved, because the deniers and the distorters and the delayers have literally declared war on people. They're dying today. We have people dying in mudslides, dying in fires, dying in floods. Farmers are losing their livelihood. Amazing things are happening, and the response is not adequate. So we have to make this an issue which goes to the ballot box, which Americans and people all around the world are saying, we have to change our direction. It can be done in a way that creates millions of jobs. This is not, people are really irresponsibly scaring people, lying to people, telling them you're going to lose your job, you're going to lose your way of life. No, you're actually going to have a healthier life. There are going to be more jobs, better paying jobs. This is a revolution that I think young people are way ahead of the leaders on this, and we have to make sure we are accountable to ourselves and to future generations.
You obviously served alongside Joe Biden in the Obama administration. The Secretary of State seemed to be supporting on this program what Rudy Giuliani, the president's personal attorney, is doing in terms of calling for an investigation into Joe Biden.
Well, first of all, it is entirely inappropriate for the president's personal attorney to be involved in another country trying to find dirt on a presidential candidate, number one. Number two, what President Trump has done is an abuse, if he has done it. And the way to prove whether he's done it or not is release the transcript of that conversation. That's how you get to the bottom of this. But there's just a, you know, for the President of the United States to be leveraging American foreign policy, hawking it, extorting the leader of another country, if that's what has happened, is unprecedented. And the last time a president did that, Richard Nixon, the Republican Party stood up and held him accountable for the abuse of power. This Republican Party today is running for cover and actually inadvertently supporting a cover-up if what is alleged is true. The only way to get at it is release the transcript, let everybody see what the president said. And if he leveraged American foreign policy and foreign aid to get a president of another country to be the opposition research arm of his campaign, that is a fundamental, profound, and deeply disturbing abuse of power.
Do you know what Secretary Pompeo was talking about when he said election interference? I mean, were you surprised he talked about that?
No, I don't. I don't know what that is.
Is it an appropriate thing for the Secretary of State to be talking about?
I have no idea what he was talking about, so I'm not going to make a judgment on that.
Before you were Secretary of State, you spent decades...
I mean, maybe he was referring to the Russian piece or something. I don't know. But
I asked him about Ukraine, so he seemed to be linking it when he said election interference and Joe Biden.
Yeah, but can I say one other thing?
Yeah.
The Obama administration, as a whole administration, was working overtime to try to end corruption in Ukraine. You couldn't move forward and deal with Ukraine if you didn't end corruption. So that was the focus. It was professionals in the State Department, an ambassador who requested that we be involved to try to get a prosecutor out of the way who was not able to move. That was an administration policy. It was the professional diplomats who requested that we try to do that. So I think there's no equivalency here. The president's just throwing up a distraction. The fact is that that transcript needs to be released in order to clarify whether or not this president has again colluded in a way with another country that is inappropriate.
Can I ask you very quickly about the seat that you held in Congress?
Well, you can ask, but I'm not.
You don't want to pick someone in the primary race for your old seat in the Senate in Massachusetts. But are you surprised to see this? Does this demonstrate to you in any way the divide between, Joe Kennedy, grandson, and scion of that family as sort of the more progressive arm of the Democratic Party versus someone, Ed Markey, who you know well?
Margaret, I am not going to comment on what's happening there, and I'm not going to comment on 2020 at this point in time. There's a time when it may be appropriate, and I'll weigh in, but not today.
Hopefully it'll be with us here on Face the Nation. When you do, Mr. Secretary, always good to talk to you. We'll be right back with our panel. Stay with us.